All right, now let's look at preparing a criterion for use in our case. So to start off, what is a criterion? Let's take a look at that word, because you may never have heard that word before. Well, criterion is actually the singular version of criteria, the word criteria. And obviously you probably know what the word criteria means. So just think of that, except whereas criteria is, multiple things, multiple criteria, the singular version of criteria is criterion. And that's what we're talking about when we say my criterion for my value. It's like criteria except singular. More clearly, the criterion usually shows how you get to your value in your Lincoln-Douglas case. There's always a strong link between your value and your criterion. So what's the purpose of having a criterion? The criterion basically answers the questions, how do we get my value? What is the way to achieve my value? Or how do we know when my value has been upheld or achieved? The criterion, you can almost view it as the helper to your value. It makes your case clearer, or at least it's supposed to. Now, the criterion can be abstract, but it's generally more concrete. So the criterion is concrete. The value you want to be abstract. An abstract noun, kind of a little more muddy, but the criterion should be something that's concrete. The criterion is what makes your case, your value concrete in some cases, actually. Because the value is so abstract and vague, we need something much more concrete to anchor it down, and that's where the criterion comes in. It gives us something we can look at and touch. I mean, not literally touch it, but you know what I mean. It gives us a way to measure our value, both to know when we can uphold it and to examine examples and see when we have upheld it. We can look at, say, a certain criteria to know when we've upheld our value, I guess, and we can look at that using the criterion. So basically, because the value is vague, you use the criterion as a more specific lens to weigh the arguments. So then you can use the criterion to say, the criterion shows that the value is achieved through my side of the resolution. Therefore, fair trade is better, or free trade is better, or nationalism is better, or whatever. So the criterion shows that the value is achieved. That's one thing it can do. We're going to look a little more at the two functions of the criterion later. But as an example, say my value is societal well-being. So in other words, my value is I want society to be well off. But that's really vague because values, again, are abstract and vague. So how do I know when society is well off? How can I tell? Or how do I go about actually making society better off instead of just vaguely saying, oh, I want to make society better off? Well, that's where the criterion comes in. I can make my criterion lower crime. And I can say, by lowering crime, that's how we can help make society better off. We can also know when we've achieved well-being, societal well-being, when we have lowered crime. When we've lowered crime, that's when we know we've achieved societal well-being. That's how we know. We can use low crime as a tangible measure or indicator to know when the value has been achieved. That's basically the purpose of a criterion. It makes things more tangible and you can see them better. Hopefully that example cleared up the meaning for you. So to figure out if you need a criterion, you can ask yourself, well, first of all, the criterion can be used in two ways. And the first way is as a means to achieve your value. So the criterion can be a step to achieving your value. So when you're finding the value, you were asking why a lot, right? Why should fair trade be valued above free trade? Because reason. Why? Reason one. Maybe because of reason two. So reason two maybe is your value. Maybe one of your earlier why answers going through that process, that can be your criterion. And look in there, see if there's a criterion in there that you can use that leads to your value. You could do something along those lines. Your criterion can also be your side of the resolution. Sometimes this makes your case tighter and it's logical because your side of the resolution is supposed to lead to your value anyway. But sometimes you need an extra element other than your side of the resolution. But you can say, like, my value is prosperity, my criterion is free trade. And that's perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable. Or some people don't even use a criterion. See, the thing about a criterion is it's optional. It's optional. You don't always need it. In fact, sometimes it actually gets in the way and can make your case worse. Personally, I've never used I don't like using criterions because they just confuse me and make my case unnecessarily more complicated, and they actually make everything less clear in my case. So I don't use a criterion, and that's really a determination that's up to you as you're writing your case. If you feel your value's fine and makes sense just standing alone, you don't need anything else, then that's fine. You don't need a criterion. Whether you have one is up to you. Note, if you don't have a criterion, people assume that you implicitly have a criterion of your side of the resolution, since your side of the resolution has to lead to your value, and criterions lead to your value. So if you don't give a criterion, people just assume it's your side of the resolution, which is correct, and that's fine, but you don't even have to bring that up. All right, now let's look at the two ways you can use the criterion, the two methods of using a criterion. And one we've talked about, one, as a way to achieve the value. The criterion is a way to achieve the value. For example, if your value is safety, your criterion could be a good police force. We get safety by having a good police force. That's the first way. The second way that you can use a criterion is as a measure or indicator of when we've reached the value, when we've accomplished the value. So for example, if your value is freedom, how do we know when we have freedom? And you might say maybe criterion is freedom of the press. When we have freedom of the press, that's a good indicator that we have freedom in general, or something like that. That's just an example. There are probably better examples you could use. Now, the best criterion, though, is one that can do both of these. The best criterion can do both. It can both achieve the value and it can measure when we have reached the value. The best criterion is one that can do both of the above, both of the things that I just talked about. So now it's time for you to find your own criterion for the case you're working on. So this is steps 4 and 5 in the handout I gave you. Remember that I talked about in the last video. Let's go through steps 4 and 5. That'll walk you through finding a criterion. Put it in your outline. Remember, it's just an outline. Or you might decide, you know what, I don't need a criterion, or I don't want a criterion. That's fine too. Just skip steps 4 and 5 and just go on to the next video. So anyway, that's what you need to know about criterions. In the next video, we're going to take a closer look at definitions and fleshing those out a little more in our case. So I'll see you then.